Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see that our attendees are flowing into the room, so it's wonderful to see that all of you are able to join us this early evening or afternoon, depending on where you are at right now. And I am going to give us maybe another minute or so, so that way people who are joining can get into the room. But welcome, and thank you for joining us for our talk with Professor Cahill. I will go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have you all join us this early evening. As we gather, it is important to recognize the place that we all learn, teach, work, and collaborate. First, we acknowledge Emory University is located on Muskogee Creek land. Emory University was founded in 1836 during a period of sustained oppression, land disposition, and forced removals of Muskogee Creek and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Now Muskogee Creek is the fourth largest tribal nation with approximately 80,000 citizens. I point this out to recognize the resilience, history, and culture of the first peoples of this land. I encourage you to spend time reflecting on our campus history by visiting the comprehensive acknowledgement on the Native American and Indigenous engagement at Emory site, as well as consider courses in Native American studies offered at our institution. At Emory, our Native American and Indigenous initiative has been devoted to developing public programming around Indigenous-related topics in collaboration with the Carlos Museum, academic departments, and other parts of Emory, starting with programs about Georgia and the Southeast, from which multiple Native scholars have contributed. We are grateful to our JWJI colleagues for collaborating with us to invite more guest lecturers such as Dr. Cathleen Cahill, and create more awareness about Indigenous issues for our campus community. It is critical for our campus community to know that tribal nations, citizens, and communities are thriving and vibrant. We hope that you will continue to join us for more programming this spring, including a public reading by National Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, sponsored by the Emory Library, and a panel titled Freedmen Claims in Relation to McGirt versus Oklahoma, organized by Professor Craig Womack on March 30th. Today, we are fortunate that Dr. Cahill is joining us to share her research. She's an associate professor of history at Penn State University and author of multiple articles and books, including Recasting the Vote: How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, from which today's talk is drawn. We are especially grateful to her to speak to us about Indigenous women's suffrage in a year in which the state of Georgia has been a major focus in the news regarding voting rights. It is a pleasure to have Professor Cahill join us for National Women's History Month, and especially today, as all of Indian country is celebrating Congresswoman Deb Haaland's advancement from the Energy and Resource Committee to a full Senate vote for Secretary of Interior. Baldwin, Kellogg, and Bonin, whom we will hear about today, are the leaders whose work continues to make an impact, and in many ways lay the groundwork for Haaland's historic nomination to be the first Native American cabinet secretary. Thank you to Andrea Gillespie and Rhonda Patrick of the JWJI for organizing today's event, and to Emory College Dean Michael Elliott for supporting these efforts through funding.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Gillespie, and on behalf of the staff of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, it has been my pleasure to work with the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative in order to bring Dr. Cathleen Cahill and others to Emory to talk about such important and timely topics. I will only add a little to Beth Michelle's wonderful introduction of Dr. Cathleen Cahill. But it's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Cahill to the Emory community. Dr. Cathleen Cahill received her PhD at the University of Chicago and taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years before moving to Penn State. She, as Ms. Michelle mentioned, is the author of Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. She's also the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, which won the Labriola Center for American Indian National Book Award and was a finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clemens Book Prize. This year, she co-edited a special suffrage issue for the Journal of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era with Kimberly Hamlin and Crystal Feemster. She's also a steering committee chair for the Coalition of Western Women's History. So I am very much looking forward to this talk. And we really want to thank Dr. Cahill for speaking to us, and we want to thank you all for attending. So we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much for those introductions. That was really wonderful. I appreciate it so much. Sadly, I cannot be with you in person today, so I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional homelands of the Susquehannock people here in State College, Pennsylvania. And I really, again, want to say thank you for the invitation from Dr. Gillespie. I want to thank Rhonda Patrick for coordinating this, and then thank you to the sponsoring departments. So before I get started, I'm going to use a lot of images, and I just want to note that some of the images and some of the language on those images are from the past, when racial slurs and stereotypes were often casually used in public. And so I'll be talking critically about these things, but I just want to warn you so that when they come up, you'll be aware of that. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slideshow here. All right. So what I thought I would do is actually start with an image, and it's kind of a riddle. So I came across this image on eBay, which is very dangerous for historians. It's a press photo from the 1948 Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, and you can see the kind of Liberty Bell there on the right. The man kind of standing on the Liberty Bell and dressed in regalia is identified only as a Cherokee man from Oklahoma, and he's carrying the sign that says, "In 48, remember 28." Now, when I first saw this, I didn't understand this picture. It didn't make sense to me. And as a historian, that's always an important clue that you've stumbled upon something that can be really interesting because the past is different enough from the present that it makes you question. So the slogan clearly meant something for him, and he assumed his audience would understand what that was. But for me and many other US historians, 1928 isn't always one of those big important dates. So what was this about? Now, I'm going to leave it there, and I promise we'll come back to it. And hopefully by the end, there'll be a good answer. What I'm going to do today is take us back 100 years and talk about how nationally known Native suffragists and political activists were very strategically entering national conversations around women's suffrage to make political assertions about tribal sovereignty and Native politics. So to start with, I want to talk about what we usually think of when we say suffragists, right? These are the women we usually remember. This statue, which is called the Suffrage Pioneers, was placed in the nation's capital just 6 months after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, or the Women's Suffrage Amendment, so it was ratified in 20. The statue was placed in the Capitol in 21, and you can still see it. These are the national leaders who were white women. You probably recognize them from left to right: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. But today I'm going to argue that these women should also be considered important suffrage activists, though perhaps the word pioneers is not the best term. The stories that historians usually tell about women's suffrage and the Native experience in the late 19th and early 20th century don't always overlap when they're being told. But for the people living at the turn of the century, those two issues were happening simultaneously, and as I'll argue, they were influencing each other. So these are the three women I'm going to be talking about today, and all three of them were very active suffragists. They challenged the colonial structures under which Native people lived, especially the federal system of wardship, which I'll talk about, and the bureaucratic oversight of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They envisioned a new relationship between the United States and Native nations that was based on sovereignty and self-determination, and they envisioned a path for this through suffrage and political participation in the US system. And they often called on white suffragists to help them with these goals. So what I'm going to do before I talk about them is really quickly give you a short background on kind of what was happening, this context of federal Indian policy at the moment. So essentially, and the slide should be blank. Oh no, I want this slide. Native nations are sovereign entities that existed on the continent before the United States. After the American Revolution, the federal government continued to acknowledge this sovereignty by making treaties with those nations. And treaties, of course, are agreements that are bound by international law. But this changed after the Civil War. In 1871, as the US Army was fighting, particularly in the West, against many of those nations and forcing them under reservations, the federal government ended diplomatic relationships with Native governments and instead began to treat individual Native people as legal wards of the government who were not yet fit for US citizenship. So they are seen no longer as citizens of their own nations, but also not yet citizens of the United States. So to make these supposedly uncivilized Native people fit for US citizenship, the government developed what has become known as a policy of assimilation. This was a set of laws and institutions designed to destroy Native culture and Native political entities and transform Native people and assimilate them into the US, again, as individuals. And it relies on three broad aspects. First, allotment, or the breaking up of tribally held and treaty guaranteed land into individual plots. Second, the development of boarding schools that would remove Native children from their communities. And third, a series of laws that outlawed cultural practices, everything from outlawing men wearing their hair long to the practice of indigenous religions, right? So essentially the government was dividing reservations into farmsteads, teaching children how to behave in proper ways and farm those farmsteads. And then once they did that, the government would decide if they were civilized enough, and if they were, they could become US citizens. Now, it's important to say that while the federal government stopped recognizing Native nations, Native people did not, right? So what I'm going to do today then is look at three moments around the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The first moment really briefly looks at how white Americans were using Indians to think with as they debated women's suffrage, but also how that thinking was influenced by Native suffragists themselves. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the political theories about self-determination and citizenship that Native women developed as they were part of these suffrage conversations. And finally, I'm going to ask us to think beyond 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because that date was not as significant for Native women as it was for white suffragists. So white Americans have had a long history of using images of Indians to think about suffrage, both positively and negatively. And Native women saw that and used those tropes to engage politically as well. So I mentioned that Native people were legally considered wards of the government. Other categories of wards include children, mentally ill, or prisoners, people who were seen as not having the ability to make their own decisions and therefore needed a guardian. This is kind of like our contemporary situation with Britney Spears under a conservatorship. So white suffragists complained that without being able to vote, they were being treated like wards. and they didn't deserve to be. So you see this picture here that was commissioned by a white suffragist from Kansas for the 1893 World's Fair. And you can tell by the title that the argument that was being made is a sort of which one of these is not like the others, right? So the woman in the center is Frances Willard, who is the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is the biggest women's organization in the nation. And around her are these groups of men. They're just kind of stereotypes of men who would have been wards. So the Native American man, and then a mentally ill man who's labeled as an idiot, a prisoner, and then a man who's labeled as a lunatic at the bottom right. And this is a good example, one of many, of how white suffragists were using visual images to make arguments. And in order to counter the stereotypes of suffragists as masculine or unattractive, they often emphasized beauty and sort of intelligent looking women. And in mainstream culture, this meant white women. So this kind of visual trope erased Native women and any other women of color who were suffragists, and it also pit white women against often men of color, and especially Native men. So again, the women that I'm talking about today, let me just kind of really quickly introduce them broadly. They shared a number of things in common. They were all highly educated in sort of the Western tradition of education, and none of them actually attended the federal Indian schools, though later two of them taught in those schools. Laura Cornelius Kellog in the middle is a Wisconsin Oneida woman from Wisconsin. She graduated from the Grafton Hall School in Wisconsin. Marie Bottineau Baldwin on the left attended a Catholic high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and then went on to spend time at the St. John's Lady College in Winnipeg, Canada. Gertrude Bonin, who is also known as Zitkala-Ša, went to a Quaker mission school in Indiana when she was 8 years old. So she's the closest to having that kind of boarding school experience, though it wasn't a federal school, it was a mission school. And she later graduated from Earlham College. All of the women then went on to work for the Indian Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this influenced their activism. And finally, all of them were also active members and officers in something called the Society of American Indians. Now, this was a group that was founded in 1911, and it's really similar to the NAACP, an organization that was advocating for the rights of Native people. And the SAI really advocated for US citizenship for Native people as a way to give them political voice. And many members then hoped to use that citizenship to advocate for tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. The members of the SAI also practiced what scholars of African American history have called respectability politics. And you see a cartoon here, a political cartoon, that really sort of does a lot of work of telling us kind of how they wanted to change expectations, right? So they encouraged members to present themselves as very modern, to wear modern clothing. And again, they're all very well educated by Western standards. And they were trying to undermine these stereotypes that you see at the top, right, of uncivilized and inarticulate people. And the women that I'm talking about today certainly practice this to a certain extent. So this is Marie Baldwin, as I said, a member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation, whose reservation is in what's now the state of North Dakota. She moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1890s with her father, who was an attorney whom tribal leaders sent to contest a treaty that the tribe had with the United States. And she goes with him and works as his legal clerk. And then she also later gets a job in Washington for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And there are sort of two things that she gets involved in the city that further involve her in politics. First, she enrolls in the Washington College of Law, which was a feminist law school founded by women to train women because most law schools in the nation refused to let women take classes. And that's now actually the American University's law school. And there she becomes very involved with the suffrage movement. At the same time, along with Laura Cornelius Kellog, she helps to found the Society of American Indians and becomes its treasurer. It's really a group of people in Washington who helped found it. And as I said, they were really pushing back against the stereotypes of Native people as uncivilized. And women like Baldwin and Kellogg and Bonin called specifically for things like an appreciation of Native women's traditional art forms, which you see some of on the left-hand side there. Baldwin had an extensive art collection. They also fought against the specific stereotype of the, quote, squaw. And this was a really derogatory word. It has sexualized overtones. And so they argued that this was not an appropriate term to use when referring to Native women. They also asserted that despite what federal policy suggested and those stereotypes, that Native women were treated better in their traditional cultures than white women in mainstream US culture were. And they pointed especially to nations that had matriarchal traditions and noted that many Indigenous women had more authority in political decisions, were able to own property, had rights to their children, could access divorce, all things that were much harder for white women to do at this time. And these ideas, and you can see here that they're talking about this in interviews and in their speeches, that intrigued white suffragists, and they began to pick this up as well. So here's an image by a non-Native artist where you see that coming into the discussions. But this image still kind of implies some things. Native women are kind of in the past, and we can tell that from the clothing that they're wearing, and also kind of the motion in this photograph. The women advancing are these white suffragists, kind of marching into the future, while Native women are kind of fading into the past. And the title itself also suggests, even as it's sort of critiquing civilization a little bit because of women's position, it's still implying there's a progression, right? And Native women are going to be left behind, even though they provide an example of kind of an alternative vision of women's power in society. So in 1913, suffragists were planning a parade in the nation's capital. And they do this really deliberately the same week as Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And it's the moment that they're announcing that they're really going to focus on getting a national amendment passed for women's suffrage. And this is Alice Paul is kind of planning this. And the women of the Washington College of Law are quite involved. And someone asks Marie Baldwin if she will create a float celebrating Native women's matriarchal traditions. And this picture on the left is this picture that circulates before the parade talking about her float. And you can see that this is clearly the image that they were imagining, right? A traditional Native woman in braids and like a shawl. It's this expected, that's what an Indian looks like. Well, she ultimately said no to creating a float, but she did march. However, she marched with the lawyers from her school, and they all wore caps and gowns, not the image on the left. And this is a good example of how she played with sort of image and clothing. She knew what people expected a Native woman would look like, and then she tried to undermine those expectations using multiple images. And another way she did this was through her work as a law student. So she earns her law degree, and she's actually one of the very first Native women to do that. And then she entered a master's program the very next year in 1914, and she writes a thesis entitled "The Need of a Change in the Legal Status of the North American Indian in the United States." And this thesis was essentially a course on Native history and Native law. She basically traces the legal changes through which first Europeans and then Americans in the United States had come to believe that tribes were not sovereigns, but wards of the government. And this is a history that wasn't taught in her school and probably any other law school at the time. And she was arguing that because of this history, the current legal status of Native people consisted of, quote, confusion and chaos. And instead of a clear relationship to the United States, quote, no man can tell what his exact legal or political status is, and that this confusion was a, quote, barrier to the progress of the Indian race. Her thesis also offered a solution, which was to grant a uniform legal status to all Native people, ideally full US citizenship. And here she's right in line with the rest of the Society of American Indians. And in fact, while she's writing this thesis, they bring a petition to Woodrow Wilson in the Oval Office asking him to support citizenship legislation for Native people. But her vision of Indigenous citizenship is not what the federal policy is, right? Federal policy is sort of either or. You're either, right, Native or you're a US citizen, and there's no in between. Baldwin and these other women had a vision of what Indigenous scholar Shanina Lomoima has called a layered citizenship, that they could imagine Native people being both US citizens and citizens of their nations with treaty rights. And she argued that the treaties would continue to, quote, play a very important part in regulating the relation between the Indian tribes and individual Indians on one hand and the government on the other. So Gertrude Bonin made similar arguments in her speeches and interviews from the period. She moves to Washington, D.C. in 1917 from Utah. So her husband, Raymond Bonin, and she were both Yankton Dakota. They worked in the service and had been stationed in Utah. But she gets elected as secretary of the Society of American Indians, so they move to D.C., which is where the headquarters are. She already was kind of nationally known as a writer, and she also was active in anti-peyote work. And so she becomes, she's kind of connected to temperance circles and then suffrage debates. She's also very aware of what white Americans expected Indians to look like, and she obliged. She often, and in this period, always wore the dress that she's pictured in here, this buckskin dress, when she gave talks, and she called it her calling card, knowing that it opened doors and created opportunities for her. And again, all three of the suffragists did this to a certain extent. And they also all used a strategy that I see encapsulated in a title of one of her speeches from the time. It was called Indians, Past and Present. And she's really using sort of interest in an Indian past to gain an audience and then undermine their expectations again. She always talked about the, quote, Indians of today when she gave her talks. And to just give you an example, one slightly disappointed lecture goer reported that her address was more along the lines of a lecture on the present life of Indians rather than traditions. She had spoken on the trials, dangers, schooling, and farming, issues that face Native people on reservations, rather than sort of what he had hoped she would talk about. And she often uses her experience as a former employee of the BIA to make her point. She also used another argument to advocate for US citizenship and the end of federal wardship, which is martial citizenship. As I said, she moved there in 1917. That's just as the US is entering World War I. And many Native men, including her husband, had volunteered for or were drafted into the armed services. And she always highlighted that and pointed to the large number of Native men currently fighting for the US, many of whom were not citizens. And she argued that the lack of voting rights stretched beyond women's suffrage and was a lack of citizenship and voting rights for all Native people. So white women's and white suffragists' activism and war work during World War I helped them make claims to suffrage rights. And the movement of the 19th Amendment begins to move through Congress, and Congress passes it in 1919, and then it goes out to the states for ratification in 1919 and into 1920, and is ultimately ratified in August of 1920. But 1920 is not necessarily a major turning point for these Native suffragists. They continued to make pretty similar arguments after 1920, because what changes is less their status. They don't become citizens, and so they are not in fact enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. That amendment, let's remember, says the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. But there were other ways it could be denied. And one of those was if you were a ward of the government, you couldn't vote. So they began to urge newly enfranchised white women to help them to use their political power to help Native people. So Laura Cornelius Kellog, oops, that's out of order. Laura Cornelius Kellog, that's the wrong slide too. Well, all right, okay. Publishes her book on the left here, Our Democracy and the American Indian, in the spring of 1920, just as many states were debating whether or not to ratify it. And she also wrote this book in the context of enormous land loss at Oneida in Wisconsin as a result of allotment. And she saw tribal land slipping away, and with it, the opportunity for economic self-sufficiency and self-determination. So this book is essentially her plan, a political and economic plan that she calls Lolomi. It's a Hopi word for beauty. And she too is using this idea of kind of layered citizenships. She wants to create a model whereby Native nations can coexist with the United States. And so she comes up with a model that Americans are pretty familiar with, the model of the corporation. And she says, look, tribal members can pool their land and then be kind of like investors in a corporation. And basically governance can be like a corporate board. And that this would create a situation where they had no longer had need for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to basically run their tribal land. And it would change the political relationship between Oneida and the United States. She said, under the Indian service, Indian agents were, quote, absolute despots, and that they needed to do away with, quote, the status of semi-citizenship or wardship, which was at once unconstitutional and chaotic, right? And she actually aims a lot of this at white women. And she says, she writes that nothing's going to change until white women have the right to vote. Gertrude Bonin also kept reminding white feminists that Native women and men lack the right to vote. 6 months after ratification, the National Women's Party held a conference to kind of figure out what their organization should work on next, right? And an enormous number of kind of every women's organization that you can think of was there, including, I need to add the National Association of Colored Women, though they had to insist on being there, and also Gertrude Bonin. And as you can see here, she's, quote, making her case for the recognition of the rights of Indians. And at the conference, she asserted, quote, the Indian woman rejoices with you in this day of your triumph. But she reminded them to, quote, remember the Indian woman and her keeper, by which she means the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So she's celebrating, but she's also reminding them that this doesn't extend to Native women. And she asked them to support a citizenship bill that was before Congress. And she reworks this final, this essay, and it becomes, my slides are out of order here. It becomes the final essay in her book, American Indian Stories, which she publishes in 1921. So both of these books really are in the context of the suffrage movement. So as you might know, the National Women's Party doesn't take up the cause of Native women, but focuses on the Equal Rights Amendment. But another group of women do hear Bonin's call, and she goes to the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which has almost 3 million members, and they take up her challenge, and they actually hire her as a lecturer, and for the next 3 years, she tours the country speaking to General Federation of Women's Clubs groups about why Native women and men should have citizenship. And one of the talks she gives at this time is this one, and she's not just calling for citizenship, but like Kellogg, she has kind of a really well-developed plan for revitalizing Native communities and reforming the relationship between Native nations in the US. She uses this chart to illustrate her speeches. This is actually pretty big, like 3 feet wide. And it's from the Newberry Library in Chicago. And she's also critiquing the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So on the left-hand side, is what we have, which is bureaucracy, which are Native people on reservations, quote, without a voice in their own affairs or expenditure of their monies. In the middle circle, it's all bureaucracy. The employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the superintendents, the Department of the Interior, all of whom control Native people's lives. In its place, she imagined the wheel on the right, what we want, which is democracy, she says, or government by the people. And this you see is surrounded by the Constitution of the United States there on the outer wheel. In place of that bureaucracy, the hub of this wheel is basically self-determination. She said, the hub shall be an organization of progressive Indian citizens driven by community interests of the Indians themselves, starting with precinct officers, district officers, reservation executive committees, an Indian Citizenship Association, and then Washington, D.C., right? And all of these levels would be filled with competent Native leaders who had taken courses in standardized law, American government, and treaties. She also urges women's participation in this, reminding people that women should be able to vote. And again, like Kellogg, argues that Native nations should be able to coexist. And like Kellogg, she uses her own community at Yankton as the example that she's thinking of. So she really emphasizes communal land, but also communal cattle herds as the economic engines for this vision of self-determination. So again, unlike federal policymakers and many other white Americans, she could imagine how Native people might be citizens of both their tribal nations and of the United States. So this advocacy results in 1924, in part it's this advocacy, by Congress passing the Indian Citizenship Act. Now this act basically confers US citizenship on all Native people. And it's really important to point out that not all Native people wanted it, right? The women I'm talking about do. But many Native people thought, well, you know, we have our own nations and we have our own citizenship, and what we need is those diplomatic relationships between the US. So for example, many members of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy rejected this. And in fact, in 1923, a group of them go to the League of Nations to advocate and ask the League to recognize their sovereignty. So that's just important to point out. But Gertrude Bonin's really excited about the possibilities of this act. And in 1926, she and her husband Raymond found what's called the National Council of American Indians, and she becomes its first president. And this is a picture of it, of the folks in it. And in the middle is, of course, not a real Native person, but like a cigar store Indian. And then you can see here that they're really imagining, and it's mostly her, she's really the driving force, an intertribal political organization, but that's rooted in local communities, and that they kind of work towards the national headquarters in DC. She begins to correspond with people on reservations across the country, and as well as create a series of pamphlets in which she she's describing what the Indian Citizenship Act does and encouraging Native people to register to vote and use their new power as voters. She urges them to organize for mutual protection. She reminds members that, quote, women are invited to join because women are voters. And again, voting is really central to this. On the right, you see a pamphlet where she really goes after one of the representatives from South Dakota and encourages all of the Sioux or Lakota and Dakota people to vote against him. She says, vote against state politicians who, quote, want to take all the land away from Indians. And, quote, it is up to the Sioux Indians to show him that they can't mistreat them and still get their votes. She and Raymond are also spending their summers for about 3 years traveling throughout Indian country, driving around to different reservations and helping communities establish these local groups that they called lodges. And to just give you a sense, in the first year, they reported, quote, "We had a very successful trip throughout Indian country in the Carolinas, Georgia, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas before returning to Washington." So the motto was "Help Indians help themselves." And she wrote that Native people had been a century under a bureaucratic regime that had handicapped them, though they had had their own political organizations, councils, and public criers. And so they needed to return to this kind of self-governance through voting. And what you see on the pamphlet on the left is she's laid out the population of Native people in different states. And she really sees that they can have power at the state level in a number of states, right? Because if they all vote, that's a pretty substantial number of people. And so in 1928, the future seems kind of bright for them. 1928 was a presidential election year, and the Republican candidate for president, Herbert Hoover, had as his vice presidential candidate, Senator Charles Curtis. Now, Charles Curtis was a Native man, or as he put it, "I'm 1/8 Kaw Indian and 100% Republican." And it's widely known in Washington that he is Native, and he's one of several Indigenous men who served in Congress at this time. And the National Women's Party, where you see him speaking here, actually endorses the Republican ticket in 1928 because Charles Curtis was the first senator to introduce the Equal Rights Amendment on the floor of the Senate, which he does in 1923 and then for several more years later. A number of Native people are really thrilled by this nomination. People attend his rallies. Newspapers report that they're registering to vote for him. Native women are participating in the Republican campaign structure. And in fact, his place on the ticket sort of highlights these new Native voters and forced Democratic candidate Al Smith to kind of tout his own credentials in Indian country. And he had been governor of New York, so he talked a lot about how he'd worked with the Haudenosaunee in New York. And Laura Cornelius Kellog, who's Oneida, and the Oneida are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, actually endorses Al Smith and stumps for him in Michigan. And she said, "Hoover hasn't got all the Indian votes." So Bonin is also very happy about this. She writes to Curtis to congratulate him, but she too and her organization actually ultimately endorsed Smith instead of the Hoover-Curtis ticket. And of course, Hoover and Curtis win. So on one hand, the election of a Native man to the position of vice president, and he's the first person of color to hold that position before Kamala Harris. On one hand, that seems to justify Bonin's optimism about participating in the electoral system and the possibilities of Native voting, right? But it obscures a more concerning trend if we think about it that way. As I said, Bonin recognized that in some states, Native people could have a really large political clout. And white Americans in those states recognize that as well. So here are a number of headlines from different states. The headline in the upper right, which is particularly negative, is from New Mexico. So again, there's real concern about this, and many state legislatures moved very quickly after 1924 to take away these rights just as Native people gained them. They often followed the tactics of Southern Jim Crow laws, using literacy tests and poll taxes. But in other states, they used the relationship between Native nations and the federal government as the reason to disenfranchise Native people. So in New Mexico and Arizona in 1924, court cases, the state Supreme Court rules that Native people who live on reservation land are disenfranchised. They cannot vote, even though the Citizenship Act has passed. And in those states, the majority of Native people live on reservations, right? So that essentially disenfranchises almost all of them. Gertrude Bonin was outraged by this. Referring to Arizona, she wrote, quote, "If our Vice President-elect, Honorable Charles Curtis, an Indian, had lived as a member of a tribe on a reservation in Arizona, he would be disenfranchised. He could not vote, much less run for the vice presidency of the United States." So in the decades after 1928, these laws really stifle Native political participation and electoral participation. In Arizona and New Mexico, those rulings stand until 1948, when returning veterans return and sue. And many other forms of disenfranchisement weren't overturned until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and its extensions over the next couple of years. So, for example, states with large Native populations like Alaska, Arizona, and South Dakota were covered under the pre-clearance clauses. We usually think about that as something that applies only to states in the former Confederacy. And that pre-clearance clause, which said that the Justice Department had to look at any legislation that changed voter registration or voting access, had to be overseen or pre-cleared. That was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013 with Shelby v. Holder. So let's return to this image that we started with from 1948 to kind of conclude. I hope that this image, now that the riddle of it might be a little clearer to you, that it evokes a much more vibrant history of Native suffrage. The sign signals that optimism around Native voting of 1928 and the possibility that Native people could be an important constituency in certain states. It also reminds us of Native office holding with Charles Curtis's election in 28. And perhaps not meaning to, but it also invokes those court cases in 1948 that veterans brought in New Mexico and Arizona, though it would still take decades to address disenfranchisement, and Native people continue to be disenfranchised in particular ways today. But this image also raises another issue that I think is important. Most of our discussions of Native voting history have focused on men, in part because those post-war cases were brought by male veterans. But, right, as I hope I've demonstrated, if we shift our gaze back to the turn of the century, we're reminded that Native women are also very involved in these debates. So what I'd like to conclude with is this image, right, a really contemporary image. As Beth Mitchell pointed out when she was talking at the beginning, this is a really historic day for Native people, but particularly for Native women. So Deb Haaland's nomination as Secretary of the Interior was voted out of committee today, and the Senate will vote on her confirmation later. Haaland, of course, is a Laguna Pueblo woman and congressional representative from New Mexico. She's one of the two first Native women who were ever elected to Congress. And this happened in 2018 when she and Sharice Davids, who's a Ho-Chunk woman from Kansas, were both elected in the same year. So both became the first. She was nominated, Haaland, by President Biden to serve as Secretary of the Interior, which of course oversees many things, including America's public lands, national parks, and of course, the federal trust relationship with Native nations. No Native person has ever held this position, or indeed any cabinet position, and so her confirmation would be, it's already historic, but if she is voted on by the Senate, it will be incredibly historic. And what strikes me about this sign, which was put up in support of Haaland by tribes in Montana, are the echoes across this century of Native women's activism. Like Native women at the turn of the century, she's often uses clothing to signal the ongoing cultural traditions of her Pueblo people. And the text here really echoes Bonin's call to Americanize the first American. So I hope that the stories I've shared here today give you a sense of that long history as well as its ongoing legacy. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cahill. We really appreciate that interesting and informative talk. As Rhonda Patrick has noted in the chat, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Beth and I are going to alternate these reading questions. So our first question comes from Mandy Sur-Sitzma, who's a faculty member in English, who writes, I hadn't seen that awesome wheel Zitkala-Ša or Gertrude Bonin made before. Can you tell us where you found it? And also just speak a bit more about your process, how you came to this project, the archives you engaged, etc.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I love that wheel, and that's really one of the pieces of evidence that helped me start thinking about how these women were political theorists, because that's such a visualization of what she's trying to do. And in terms of finding it, I think it was a really valuable lesson in talking to people about your project. And I was at the Newberry Library in Chicago when I was a grad student there, and was talking to someone who was not a scholar of Native history, but he was a librarian there. And he said, you know, I think we have this thing. It was in a woman named Mae Walden, who was a white woman in Chicago. She was a socialist activist. And she has this in her papers, and it's it, right? That's all she has from Bonin, but she has this. And it must have been that Bonin gave a speech at some point to her organization, and it ended up in there. And I had never seen it before either. I'd seen some written descriptions about it, but never the picture itself. And so, as I said, it really helped me see what she was trying to do. It's such a great visualization. And in terms of how I came to the project, my first book was on the employees of the Federal Indian Service. And so let me just tell you really quickly how I came to that. That one, I'm from Northern California originally, really far northern, so 5 hours north of San Francisco. And the two largest tribes in California are there, near where I grew up, the Yurok and the Hupa Nation. And so for me, Native people were kind of always really visible. We played basketball up at the Hupa Reservation, and 10% of the county is Native. So I kind of always knew that Native people are still, right, part of our modern society. But I read a book about two white women who were sent by the Indian Bureau out to the mountains of Northern California from New York City, which for them is like the middle of nowhere, right? It's the center of the world for the people who live there, but for white women from New York, and they talked about how it's this wilderness, right? And I thought, what was the federal government doing hiring women in 1909, so before, right, they have the right to vote, including in California where they get it in 1911, sending them off by themselves, right, to do this? That didn't fit with my stories about women's history. And so again, it was one of those moments where I thought, what's up with that? So I ended up writing about employees of the Indian Service, and it turned out there were a lot of women. There were a lot of white women, and there are also a lot of Native women. And I wanted to know, why would Native women work for the Bureau? And in the process of that, I came across Gertrude Bonin, but particularly Marie Bottineau Baldwin and her participation in that suffrage parade. And when I found that, it didn't make it into the first book, but it really sparked my interest about, again, raising this question. Phil Deloria, who's a scholar of Native studies, an incredible scholar, has a book called Indians in Unexpected Places. And it's such a really fabulous way of thinking about this. Why do when I found Marie Baldwin in that parade, why was it unexpected? Why didn't I expect to find Native women in a suffrage parade? And so that kind of was the kernel that I started the book with. And it expanded from there, but that's how I came to it. So thank you.
It looks like we have another question that comes in from Heidi, who is one of our visiting faculty in the music department. So you spoke about Zitkala-Ša's relationship with the wider American community and what she did for the right to vote. Can you talk about Zitkala-Ša's was considered a bit more controversial to Indigenous peoples because we saw conflict with accepting the right to vote as accepting of the loss of land. What they really wanted was their land back as it was before.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you probably know that she's a really accomplished musician, violinist and piano player, and she wrote something called the Sundance Opera that was performed first in Utah and then later in New York. Yeah, right. All three of these women are connected to their home communities and often return to the reservations. I would say Kellogg is the most closely connected. She lives in Wisconsin. The other two live away from their home communities for much of their life, but they have these kinship networks, and they do return home, pretty regularly. So that does make them different than a lot of other Native women or Native men who are activists as well, right? So I certainly don't want to imply that all Native people are advocating this, right? That there's definitely multiple strategies across Indian country, right? I mean, it's such a diverse, landscape. I will say though that I see all three of them really centering questions of land and treaty rights in ways that were right there. Even though they're calling for U.S. citizenship and the right to vote, at the end of the day, what they want are those land and treaty rights to be protected, and they see voting as a way to do that. Absolutely, other people really disagree with this. And there's a really great new book by Maurice Crandall that's about New Mexico and the Pueblo's relationship to voting. And there, the Pueblo absolutely argue that if we participate in US elections, we will be ceding kind of our treaty rights. And so we're not going to do it. In part because they've been told this by the federal government. So their strategy is really quite different. And that book is called These People Have Always Been a Republic. So you're right, it's very different. Bonin, though, I mean, when she, Susan Dominguez has written about her and writes that after she passes away in 1932, I think it is, there are many people who, continue to see her as a really important activist and tribal member. So yes, right. Certainly one of the criticisms is these women engaged with kind of the US system of voting and citizenship, and not everybody did that. But I think they were doing it in particular ways that always centered sovereignty and tribal land in particular.
Thank you. The next question is from Megan O'Neill, who is one of the faculty members involved in the initiative and whose appointment is in art history. Can you talk about the other ways that Native women have been involved in political advocacy in relation to the federal government? For example, in gaining federal recognition for their nations?
Yeah, right. I'm only talking about this early 20th century, and there's the whole rest of the 20th century. And there's been some really great new work. Holly Geis at the University of New Mexico has written about Elizabeth Peratrovich from Alaska, who was part of the Alaska Native Sisterhood and really essential in getting the state of Alaska to pass a Civil Rights Act that addressed kind of the way in which Native people were being, really had second-class citizenship in Alaska. Talking about women in tribal government, I think is a really huge place to see Native women's activism, because of course, right, Native women are serving as tribal chairs on tribal councils, as tribal judges. And so that's a big part of it. And, I personally think that, John Collier is talking very extensively with Gertrude Bonin and all of these women, but especially Bonin. They work together. And I think the Indian New Deal and some of his ideas are certainly influenced by her. And again, the Indian New Deal is basically under Franklin Roosevelt. Collier becomes Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and the Indian Reorganization Act passes, and basically the United States re-recognizes those tribal governments, but tries to impose particular structures. So constitutions that look very much like the US Constitution. And again, not all nations like the Navajo reject that, for example. But the federal government does come around in the 1930s to re-recognizing governments, and then over the course of the 20th century, kind of more fully recognizing sovereignty, especially under Richard Nixon in self-determination. And Native women are, absolutely kind of involved in a lot of those things. But, and I think this is really important too, they're also involved in, kind of a politics of cultural continuity, right? And keeping cultural traditions and language and religion and ceremony going in their communities. And those are really important aspects as well that are absolutely political. And I didn't write about them, but there's some really fantastic work. So Kutcha Riesling-Baldi has written a book called We Are Dancing for You about Native women kind of reviving the coming of age ceremony among the Hupa people in Northern California, and how, right, these are feminist acts. This is Indigenous feminism. And I think that's part of the bigger story that as we think about the 20th century has to be part of what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have another question from Deborah, who is in the anthropology department. And she asks if you could share your reflections on why it has taken so long to understand and recognize the roles that Indigenous women have played in the suffragist movement.
Yeah, I think that image, right, of who is a suffragist is a really powerful one. That there's a great book called The Myth of Seneca Falls that shows how Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton really set the narrative, right? They literally wrote the history. They wrote a 6-volume history of women's suffrage. And kind of every historian who then wanted to know about women's suffrage kind of started there. And that set of volumes was really from their very particular point of view. So it highlights their organizations to the kind of exclusion of other white women like Lucy Stone. African-American women appear a tiny bit, but really are pretty much, their activism is not mentioned. And Native women aren't in there. Although I will say and there's a little bit about Indigenous Hawaiian women in like a paragraph in the 6 volumes. But so that kind of was the starting point and throughout the 20th century. And so that was a really powerful kind of template. I think it's really, I know I'm indebted to African-American feminist scholars for really kind of pushing what is a suffragist, who is a suffragist, what do they look like, what are their politics, and why don't we think of them in that way? So I think, the conversations around the anniversary in the past couple of years have really tried to disrupt that really familiar story. And I think have been, we're starting to see some success, and I think that's fantastic. And I'm really happy that I can be a little part of that, and really just kind of open up again. If you start with the papers of kind of the white suffragists, you don't see a lot of these women. But if you start with the Native women themselves, you see them, that they're definitely in these spaces and in these conversations.
Thank you. So Dr. Verdali pointed out that Peratrovich had a Google Doodle. So I just put that link in the chat for everyone. Are there any other questions? I'll give a minute.
Yeah, we were saying that Google Doodle has been kind of doing quite a few. I think they had Gertrude Bonin the other day as well.
Yeah, they did. So, well, seeing no other questions, I do want to, thank Dr. Cahill. And so I know you can't see everybody in the webinar, but we're all applauding you, and we really want to thank you for your time. And I want to point us to the Native American and Indigenous engagement website. that Dr. Vidali manages. And so that includes all of the activities and all of the programming that's being done around Native American and Indigenous studies at Emory. So there are a lot of events coming up this month, and we hope that you will attend those events. We want to thank you for being a part of today's event, and we hope that you have a great evening. Thank you so much.